In 2023, Americans wrote 2 billion paper checks. Germans wrote 0. Dutch citizens wrote 0. Swedish citizens wrote 0. Norwegians wrote 0. In most of Northern Europe, the paper check has been completely extinct as a payment method for over a decade. In some countries, you cannot even cash one if someone tried to give you one. The United States, meanwhile, still runs on a payment system that most of the developed world abandoned during the early 2000s. Rent checks, utility checks, personal checks, business checks, tax refund checks, birthday checks from grandparents. American adults under 30 today are still being taught how to write checks because they are still required in dozens of common situations. This is one of the most measurable infrastructure gaps between the United States and the rest of the developed world, and almost no American realizes it exists until they try to pay a European landlord and discover the landlord has no idea what a check is. If you have ever moved to Europe and tried to pay your first month's rent the way you would in America, only to be politely told that nobody accepts checks here, you have already experienced the second-order effect of this video. Here is what should bother you for the next 10 minutes. The American check system is not still around because Americans love paper. It is still around because the financial infrastructure underneath American payments was built in a different era and never got the upgrade Europe quietly executed during the 2000s. The reason traces back to specific decisions made by American banks and European banks during a 15-year window that completely separated the two continents into different relationships with how money moves. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why you still write checks, why Europe stopped, why even the most modern American payment apps still rely on a check infrastructure underneath, and why this gap is going to take at least another decade to close. Stay with me, because the third reason involves a single American banking decision in the 1990s that locked the country into the system you are still using today. Here is the punchline up front. Americans still use checks not because the technology to stop did not exist. They use them because of three things stacked together that quietly froze the American payment system in place. A banking infrastructure that was built around check clearing and never replaced its foundation. A regulatory environment that allowed checks to remain legally protected even as digital alternatives emerged. And a financial industry decision in the 1990s to keep checks as the default for billions of transactions rather than invest in a real-time payment network. Take any one of those three away and the American check system starts to die. Take all three away, which is essentially what Europe did, and you get the cashless, instant, paper-free payment infrastructure that most Europeans now consider normal. And here is the part most people never realize. The amount of money still moving through American checks is staggering. In 2023, American checks moved over $33 trillion between accounts. That is more than the entire annual GDP of the United States, processed by a payment method that physically requires paper, ink, and postal mail in many cases. The system is enormous, expensive to maintain, and completely invisible to most Americans who do not realize how much of the financial system is still running on it. Hidden Systems explains the everyday things in your wallet and your daily life that look like simple, obvious tools but are actually the result of decades of infrastructure decisions you never agreed to. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one. Now let me walk you back to where this divergence started. In the 1990s and early 2000s, both the United States and Europe were facing the same problem. The check system was slow, expensive, and inefficient. Checks took days to clear. They could bounce. They cost banks money to process. They required physical handling, transportation, and verification. Europe responded by building a new system from scratch. In 1999, the European Union introduced the Single Euro Payments Area framework, which began standardizing electronic payments across all member states. By 2008, the system was operational. By 2014, all European banks were legally required to support SEPA transfers, which move money between any European bank account within one business day, often within hours, at minimal cost. The Netherlands stopped using checks in 2002. Most of the Nordic countries phased them out by 2007. Germany followed by 2010. Within roughly a decade, paper checks disappeared from European daily life. Banks stopped issuing them. Businesses stopped accepting them. Customers stopped writing them. The United States chose a different path. Instead of building a new real-time payment system, American banks invested in making the existing check system faster. Check imaging was introduced in 2004 through the Check 21 Act, which allowed banks to process digital images of checks instead of physical paper. The system became faster on the back end, but the checks themselves did not disappear. First cause. American banking infrastructure was built around check clearing. By the 1990s, American banks had spent decades building an enormous infrastructure specifically for processing checks. The Federal Reserve had check clearinghouses. Banks had check imaging systems. Businesses had accounts payable systems built around check processing. Software vendors sold check management tools. An entire industry existed to handle the trillions of dollars moving through checks every year. Replacing all of that with a real-time payment system would have required years of investment, regulatory changes, and coordination between thousands of banks. It would have disrupted billions of transactions. It would have cost the banking industry hundreds of billions of dollars to build correctly. The math was difficult. The decision was made implicitly. Improve the check system rather than replace it. Here I have to admit something. When I started researching this video, I assumed Americans just liked checks for sentimental or cultural reasons. The data forced me to throw that assumption out completely. Americans do not love checks. Polling consistently shows that most Americans would prefer instant digital payment for everything. The check system survived because the financial industry kept investing in it rather than building the infrastructure that would have made it unnecessary. The customer never had a real choice. The infrastructure decided for them. The behavior did not precede the system. The banking investment created the system, and the system kept producing the behavior decade after decade. Second cause. American regulation allowed checks to remain legally protected. This is the part that explains why even modern American payment apps still bump into check-era rules. The Uniform Commercial Code, which governs American commercial transactions, was written with check-based payments in mind. Specific legal protections, specific timing rules, specific dispute resolution procedures, all built around checks as the default. American businesses operate under tax and accounting rules that explicitly accept and expect checks. Government agencies often still mail tax refunds, benefit payments, and other distributions as physical checks. European regulators rewrote their financial rules during the SEPA transition to specifically remove check protections and incentivize digital alternatives. American regulators did not. The legal framework continued treating checks as a primary payment method even as European countries were eliminating them entirely. This created a strange dependency. American digital payment apps like Venmo, Zelle, and Cash App had to be built on top of the existing check clearing infrastructure rather than replacing it. When you send money on Venmo, the underlying transfer often still moves through the same systems that process paper checks. The interface is digital. The infrastructure is not. Third cause. The American financial industry decided in the 1990s to keep checks profitable. Here is the cause almost nobody knows, and it is the one that locked the system in for the long term. American banks charge fees for many check-related services: stop payments, bounce checks, cashier's checks, money orders, international wire transfers, foreign check deposits. Hundreds of billions of dollars in fee revenue depend on the continued existence of the check system, even as the underlying volume slowly declines. Replacing checks with free instant transfers would have eliminated a major revenue source for American banks. So the banks kept the system alive, invested in making it faster but not free, and resisted regulatory pressure that would have forced a transition to real-time digital payments. In Europe, the SEPA system specifically eliminated most fees for domestic transfers. Sending money to anyone in your country, or anywhere in Europe, is free or nearly free for most consumers. American banks looked at that model and chose not to follow it, because it would have meant giving up significant revenue. Compare two payment systems for a moment. A typical American renting an apartment writes a check each month, mails it to a property management office, waits for the check to clear, and continues this cycle for years. The whole process takes 5 to 7 business days from writing to clearing. The renter buys checks every few months. The landlord deposits a stack of paper monthly. The system is functional but slow, inefficient, and dependent on paper handling. A typical German renting an apartment sets up an automatic SEPA transfer when they first move in. Money moves directly from their bank account to the landlord's bank account on the first of every month, automatically, instantly, with no paper involved. The renter never writes anything. The landlord never deposits anything. The system happens silently for years. Same activity. Same century. Two completely different relationships with how money moves between people. One requires physical paper, postal mail, and multi-day clearing. The other happens invisibly in seconds. Neither is more secure than the other for legitimate purposes. They are just built on different infrastructure decisions from 20 years ago. Stack those three causes together, and you get the modern American check system. A payment method that survived past its expiration date because the infrastructure underneath it was too expensive to replace. The regulations supporting it were never updated, and the banks profiting from it had no incentive to change. So embedded in American life that schools still teach children how to write checks in math class. So locked into the financial system that even the newest payment apps are built on top of it rather than replacing it. Now here is where it gets interesting. The United States launched a real-time payment system called FedNow in 2023, more than a decade after the European equivalent. Adoption has been slow. Most American banks are not yet enrolled. Most American consumers have never heard of it. The system exists technically, but the infrastructure rollout is happening at the typical American utility pace, which means it will be another 10 to 20 years before checks fully disappear. There is one detail worth noting. Americans born after 2000 are increasingly refusing to learn how to write checks. They view them as obsolete and inconvenient. But because the underlying systems still require checks for many transactions, these younger Americans often have to learn how to write one at some point, usually when they sign their first lease or accept their first employer-required payment method. The system that should have died 20 years ago continues to recruit new generations of users because the alternatives never fully arrived. Read that backwards. The American check is not surviving because Americans want it. It is surviving because the rest of the payment system is missing the pieces that would let it die. Every check written in 2026 is a sign that the system Europe replaced in the 2000s is still the dominant infrastructure in America today. The engineers and policymakers of the 1990s who designed the modern American banking system assumed paper checks would be phased out as digital alternatives improved. They could not have foreseen that the digital alternatives would be built on top of the check infrastructure rather than replacing it, that regulatory protection would continue treating checks as essential, and that profitable bank fees would create an incentive to keep the system alive long after it should have died. Every paper check you write today is the visible part of a financial system Europe quietly walked away from while America was still investing in it. When was the last time you wrote a paper check? And what was it for? Drop it in the comments. I want to see what is still requiring checks in your part of the world. I read every single one.